I'm Kamal Kishore. I work on disaster risk reduction and recovery issues. Today, we'll talk about what happens in a post-disaster, post-crisis situation, the external response to a big disaster, and the support to communities. We can divide it in three interrelated areas: immediate rescue and relief efforts, long-term reconstruction and recovery, and early recovery. The immediate rescue and relief effort in the international arena is coordinated by the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, or OCHA. In case of major earthquakes, one key element which is quite unique to earthquakes is the search and rescue. For search and rescue, most countries, especially countries which are earthquake prone, have search and rescue teams which specialize in urban collapse structure search and rescue, and they are certified by something called INSARAG, International Search and Rescue Advisory Group. They are coordinated, they arrive on site with specialized equipment, know-how, sniffer dogs, and under the coordination of OCHA, they carry out search and rescue operations. Just to give you an example, in case of Nepal earthquake in 2015, there were 76 teams from across the world responding in terms of search and rescue after the earthquake. Typically, the initial response and relief lasts from 3 to 6 months. In some situations where it is a very complex event, there are issues of accessibility, the losses are widespread, there are underlying vulnerabilities, it can be longer. But typically there is 3 to 6 months. At the international level, there is a mechanism called CERF, CERF, Central Emergency Response Fund, which is a standing replenishable fund. And in response to a flash appeal or a response plan prepared by the government with the support of the UN, money is immediately released from the CERF to support the relief and rescue efforts for the first 3 to 6 months. The whole area of relief and rescue is extremely challenging. The first thing is, of course, the timeliness of the response. For example, in earthquakes, if the response for search and rescue arrives 3 days later, it's almost of no use. At the same time, it has to be very relevant support. There are numerous examples where people from across the world, out of a sense of compassion, or there is great outpouring of support, but they send irrelevant or not suitable relief to the affected people. For example, medicines are sent into an area with all the labeling in languages that are not understood locally, or food items sent which are not consumed in that particular culture. So it is important to keep the assistance both very timely, swift, and at the same time relevant. A very quick and dynamic assessment of what are the life-saving needs of the affected people. And these needs are changing very rapidly. How do we quickly assess that and dynamically respond to that? That's a big challenge as well. There is so much support from both the national sources from within the country which is affected, as well as international sources. There is a huge outpouring of support. Coordinating it, keeping track of who is doing what where is extremely important. And in that respect, there are a number of international organizations that just provide coordination support. There are agencies that just quickly set up a facility on site to produce maps of where the affected people are, and also mapping who is doing what where in terms of humanitarian agencies. What are the gaps that are being reported from the field, which then helps direct humanitarian agencies in directing their response appropriately. A corollary of that challenge is ensuring that you reach everyone. There are numerous examples where the people who are easily accessible or more visible on TV, for example, get disproportionate amount of attention at the expense of people who are difficult to access or who are not very vocal in expressing their needs. tend to get left out. So how do we make sure that while making a timely, relevant, rapid response, we also reach everyone, the most vulnerable and marginalized as well? And finally, the big challenge of relief is not to create dependency. It is very easy to set up a system and do things which will compromise the local initiative, the local way of doing things by people for themselves, and create long-term dependency on relief. And then that perpetuates the need for relief for months, sometimes years. In urban areas, the search and rescue and relief and response bit is even more challenging. Just to highlight one or two of those challenges. One is that shelter, temporary shelter after disaster. A lot of the times the building stock may not be safe after a disaster. How do we ensure that people are located temporarily in safe locations? Where are those pre-identified locations? Is there enough space to accommodate temporary settlements for a long period of time? At the same time, there is also issues of people wanting to go back to live in houses that are partially damaged in the absence of other options. How do we ensure that people do not take actions which actually compromises their safety? So there are some challenges which are very specific to urban areas. Let's turn our attention to long-term reconstruction. Long-term reconstruction essentially focuses on restoring what has been lost and hopefully also building it better to more resilient standards, to more sustainable standards, and also to standards that represent better quality of life for the affected people compared to the situation before the disaster. Typically, long-term reconstruction is preceded by a detailed post-disaster needs assessment, which is also referred to as PDNA. For PDNA, we have a methodology, internationally accepted methodology, which has been developed, applied, and refined over the last 25 years or so. We applied it very recently in Nepal and came up with a very thorough assessment of what the damages and needs are in that affected area. It focuses on all sectors. It focuses on productive sectors such as agriculture, manufacturing. It focuses on social sectors such as health, education, housing, as well as on infrastructure sectors such as transportation, communication, power supply, and so on. It systematically assesses the damages and needs and comes up with an assessment of how much money would be required across these sectors for reconstruction to better standards. Quite often, housing represents a very large chunk of reconstruction needs. To give you an example, in Nepal, 59% of the cost of damages and hence needs was in housing sector alone. And housing is also one of the most challenging sectors of recovery. Simply because there are many stakeholders and there is also a sense of urgency about restoring housing for many people. Housing is at the center of, it is perceived to be at the center of people's recovery, and establishing supply chains for building materials, making building workers who are qualified available in a short period of time in large numbers is a challenging task. How do we train hundreds, sometimes thousands of building masons to build differently, to build to disaster resilient standards? So that's a big challenge. Over the last 20-30 years, there has been a lot of literature developed based on practice on different approaches to housing. And there's a whole range from contractor-driven housing, where basically the reconstruction of housing is contracted out to contractors, to a situation where building materials are provided to house owners and they can, and along with some cash, and they can do whatever they want. to totally owner driven, community driven housing, to a combination of these three approaches. And all of these three in different situations have their advantages and disadvantages. However, we can say that according to our current understanding, the owner driven housing, where owners not just reconstruct themselves but also determine what is the kind of house they need within, of course, the parameters of what is the package of assistance they are given, and the safety standards they should adhere to. So an owner driven approach where they determine what the housing should be like, and they actually drive the housing process, is the most favored one right now. But this is not to say that this is without variations. There are lots of innovations within the owner driven approach, and it has to be very, very context specific.